It was meant to be just another storm-tossed night. But fate has a way of knocking when we least expect it, sometimes gently, sometimes like thunder. And for Jack Callahan, it began with a knock that would echo through every room of his past. If you love to hear stories of redemption, second chance, and finding love, so this is for you, and so subscribe for finding some unexpected happening of love and joy. Let's back on story. The rain hadn't been the soft, rhythmic kind that comforts. No, this was the bitter sort, cold, slicing, and relentless, slashing across Jack's windshield like it had a score to settle. His wiper struggled to keep up as he turned off Highway 17 onto the muddy vein of gravel that was Willow Road. He knew every turn, every tree of it. He'd driven this road since he was a boy. But tonight, as the storm poured like sorrow from the sky, something inside him tightened. Storms had a way of unearthing ghosts, especially for a man like Jack. The shadows of the trees danced in his headlights, gnarled limbs stretching like twisted memories across the slick ruts in the road. He was minutes from his cabin, his sanctuary, his exile, when something flickered in the beam ahead. Not just one shape, but several. He hit the brakes. The truck slid slightly before halting, and he leaned forward, peering through the watery glass. A woman stood there in the downpour, her frame soaked to the bone beneath a rain-darkened military jacket. In one hand, a dying flashlight. In the other, she braced a boy of around 10. 3 more children huddled beside them under a blanket that was more memory than material. A teddy bear, sodden and limp, was clutched in the arms of the youngest, a girl no older than 5. Jack rolled down the window. The wind shoved rain into the cab, stinging and cold. "You folks okay?" he called, voice low but sure. The woman stepped forward, cautious but composed. Exhaustion clung to her like the rain, but her voice held. "Our SUV broke down. No signal. We tried to walk to town, but—" She glanced back at the children. "They're freezing." Jack hesitated for only a breath. "Climb in." No more words. No time to deliberate. He stepped out into the storm, opened the passenger door, and helped usher them into the truck. The little girl with the bear looked up at him, her gaze far too calm for someone so small. There was something unsettling about it, not fear, but familiarity. The woman was last to enter. Before she closed the door, she turned to him, voice hoarse. "Thank you. I'm Grace. Grace Holloway." "Jack," he replied. "Jack Callahan. You're lucky," he added as he shifted into gear. "You weren't 2 miles farther. That bridge floods in storms like this. I've got a place just up the road. You can get warm there." As they drove, the cab filled with the scent of rain-soaked clothes and something else. Fatigue, desperation, the kind of silence that grows in the wake of long, hard battles. The children barely spoke. The boy, Max, sat like stone, watching the trees. The 2 middle girls whispered beneath the blanket. The littlest, Ellie, clinging to her bear, never took her eyes off Jack, her gaze steady in the rearview mirror like she was reading a story only she knew. When the cabin came into view, its lamplight glowing softly through the sheets of rain, Jack parked, stepped out, and led them in. The place was modest. Old pine floors, a wood stove at the heart of it, the smell of cedar and ash. A single haven in a storm-battered world. Jack moved fast, lighting the stove with muscle memory, coaxing flame from dry logs like it was a prayer. "You'll have to excuse the mess," he muttered. Grace gave a faint smile, her lips chapped and trembling. After tonight, this might as well be the Ritz. He fetched towels, pulled out an old quilt, and handed out mugs of cocoa and hot tea. Grace's hands shook as she distributed them, the heat beginning to restore what the cold had stolen. Names trickled out like hesitant raindrops. Max, 12. Abby and Nora, 10 and 8. And the littlest, silent as snowfall, was Ellie. "She doesn't talk much," Grace said quietly later, sitting beside the fire. "Hasn't not really since." Her voice trailed off like smoke. Jack didn't push. That night, with the children tucked in near the fire on makeshift bedding, Grace stood beside him in the dim kitchen. Her voice was low. "You didn't have to take us in." "I know," Jack replied simply, "but I've been out there. Nights like this, they leave marks. She studied him, her eyes tracing something beneath his surface. Military. Fire department, he said. Then softer. Used to be. A silence fell. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Ellie was still awake. Still staring. She hasn't looked away from you since we got here, Grace whispered. Jack met the girl's eyes again. She blinked once, then gave the slightest nod, like she saw through time. A current passed through him. The kind of recognition you don't understand but feel anyway. The next morning crept in gray and heavy, mist curling around the cabin like forgotten sorrow. The fire had burned low, leaving a soft glow over the pinewood floor. Jack stirred first, as he always did. Years of firehouse calls had trained his body to wake early. That uniform might have been packed away a decade ago, but the man inside it still lingered. He brewed coffee quietly, glancing toward the heap of slumbering children, their mother still in her uniform top, slumped in a chair with one boot on. She hadn't even taken off her jacket. She looked like she was bracing for war, even in sleep. Then came a sound, bare feet on wood. Ellie. She stood there, small, solemn, silent, teddy bear in hand. She walked to the table and sat like she'd done it every morning. Morning, Jack said gently. She nodded, said nothing. Her eyes found his again, unblinking, knowing. He peeled a banana and set it in front of her. Not fancy, but it's breakfast. She took it with both hands, still without speaking. I've got cereal, too, he offered. She stared at him, then spoke, not loud, but like wind through an open door. You smell like smoke. Jack froze. She didn't smile, didn't blink, just took a bite like she hadn't just cracked open something ancient. He said nothing, couldn't, just poured coffee for Grace with hands that trembled slightly. By the time the others stirred, Ellie was still beside him. You owe me breakfast, Grace said with a sheepish smile, rubbing sleep from her eyes. You owe me nothing, Jack replied, handing her a mug. No good deed goes unpunished, she said. I don't believe that, he replied. Another pause. Her eyes studied him again. You live out here alone? Jack nodded. Been 10 years. She didn't ask why. People who've been through fires don't ask. They wait, respectfully, for you to hand them the match. There's a spare room, Jack added, gesturing. It's not much. Needs work, but it's yours if you want it. She hesitated. We weren't planning on staying. I have a sister, Amalia. Doesn't know we're coming, but... You can't get there today, Jack said gently. Roads washed out past the creek. She nodded slowly. Jack turned to the fridge. I've got eggs. Bacon. Unless one of you's vegetarian, then you're out of luck. A soft laugh slipped from Grace. Eggs sound like hope, she said. Jack fried them with a familiarity that brought warmth into the room. The smell filled the cabin, and for the first time in years, the table wasn't lonely. There was laughter, chewing, life. You didn't ask about my husband, Grace said quietly. Didn't seem like my place, Jack answered. He died, in a fire, 3 years ago, on base. Some kind of electrical fault. Jack turned slowly. What branch? He asked. Marines, she replied. Captain Aaron Holloway. Jack went still. That name, he had seen it. On a report. He had been there. The barracks fire. And the baby, the one they'd pulled from the smoke. Ellie. Jack sat down hard. Grace didn't notice. She was watching the kids. That night changed everything, she said, eyes far away. Ellie stopped talking. Max stopped trusting. I stopped sleeping. Then came the flood. The job loss. And then you. Jack couldn't find words. His eyes found Ellie. She was watching him. The memory came crashing back. The weight of that baby in his arms, limp but alive. Ash in his lungs. The voice on the radio calling him back. He never knew if she lived. Now she was in his home, looking at him like she always knew. Later, Jack stood alone in his shed, braced against the workbench. The rain had quieted to a whisper, but it still sang against the tin roof. He wasn't fixing anything, just standing, breathing. 3 years ago, he walked out of a burning building with a child. and let go of that memory like a leaf into a stream. Now she'd come back, not just as a girl, but as a reminder that sometimes the lives we think we've lost can find us again. That healing walks in quiet, on small feet, holding a bear. And that love, true love, deep and redemptive, doesn't knock loud. It waits in the rain, until you open the door. Ellie. Jack whispered the name into the stillness of the shed, as though the very syllables might stir something sacred buried in the silence around him. The word hung in the air, fragile and reverent, like a prayer whispered into a cathedral of memory. Behind him, the old wooden door creaked open on its hinges. "I figured you'd be out here," Grace said softly, her voice threaded with understanding. Jack didn't turn. Instead, his fingers moved slowly across the edge of a chisel, tracing the tool's worn steel like it was a lifeline. "I built this bench the first summer after I moved back," he murmured. "Didn't know what for. Just needed something to keep my hands busy." Grace stepped fully into the room, the scent of rain still clinging to the flannel shirt she'd borrowed from his closet. Her hair, damp at the ends, was pulled back with the practiced precision of someone who had no choice but to be strong. "I know that feeling," she said. "Idle hands can be dangerous when your mind's been through a battlefield." Jack nodded slowly. The silence that settled between them wasn't empty. It was weighted, sacred even, the kind of silence born not of absence, but of mutual survival. Grace leaned against the doorway, her gaze steady. Ellie used to talk all the time. She sang to her stuffed animals, made up stories about clouds. After the fire, she just stopped. Nothing. No humming. No laughter. Just this stillness. "At first," she continued, "I thought it was trauma. But lately, I don't know. I think maybe she hears things the rest of us don't. Or maybe she remembers things we've forgotten how to." Jack swallowed hard. "She said something to me yesterday," he said, "in the kitchen." Grace looked up. She said I smelled like smoke. A breath passed between them. Grace didn't speak right away. She folded her arms and let her eyes drift to the rain-blurred window, where droplets traced slow, meandering paths, like tears too tired to fall. "She has moments like that," she said finally. "Words that feel like arrows. I never know if she's remembering something or sensing something in the people around her." Jack turned to face her. "What are you saying?" Grace's voice was quiet. "I don't know, but she doesn't do that with everyone. Only with people she connects to. Deeply." Jack turned back to the workbench, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of something unspoken. "I think she remembers me," he said, "from that night." "I think you might be right," Grace replied, her voice nearly a whisper. Another silence. Grace wandered toward a shelf and picked up a half-carved piece of wood. "What's this?" she asked. "Toy chest," Jack said. "Never finished it." She studied the smooth, unfinished corners, the outlines of something that had once mattered. "Looks like you were building something important." "I wasn't," he replied, voice tight. "I was trying to forget." He picked up a piece of sandpaper and began smoothing one of the planks, hands moving automatically as his voice cracked open like a wound. "I lost my wife and daughter in a house fire 6 years ago. I was first on scene. I thought I could save them." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was a shelter. "I left the department not long after," Jack continued. "Moved out here. Started building things I'd never finish." Grace stepped closer, her eyes steady. "You're not the only one who ran from fire." He looked up. She shrugged, her voice soft. "After Aaron died, I stayed in uniform, but I wasn't the same. Every salute felt hollow. Every flag ceremony like a betrayal. I kept moving, so I wouldn't have to feel it." Jack nodded, the weight of understanding settling between them. "But Ellie," she said, eyes distant. She never moved. Not emotionally. She stayed frozen in the middle of that night, still there even now. Jack stopped sanding. His hands felt his sides. The air between them pulsed, alive with shared sorrow. "I don't know what this is," Grace said, her voice raw. "This connection between Ellie and you, but I believe it matters." Jack exhaled slowly, chest rising, and falling with something that wasn't quite grief, wasn't quite hope either. I think so too. From the house, laughter drifted out. It was soft, tentative. Abby and Nora playing a board game by the fire. Max's voice, usually flat, lifted in amusement. Ellie's voice didn't rise with them, but her presence lingered like a lighthouse, steady and silent, guiding from afar. Grace glanced at the sky. The roads are still washed out. We can't leave today. Jack nodded. You can stay as long as you need. Grace smiled, a small, weary thing, but genuine. We may need more than a few nights. Jack's voice was steady. Then build something while you're here. She looked down at the toy chest. Maybe I will. They walked back together beneath the soft percussion of rain. As Jack opened the front door, Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table again, hands folded in front of her, waiting. She looked at Jack, then at her mother. And then, without fanfare or ceremony, she spoke in a small, certain voice. It's okay now. It was the first thing she'd said that day. And somehow, everyone understood exactly what she meant. That night, the rain faded to mist, and by morning, the forest beyond Jack's cabin shimmered in the fragile warmth of early spring. The world outside steamed like it had exhaled in relief. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, rhythmic drops, and the air smelled sweet, like new beginnings. Jack stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the fog lift. Behind him, Grace was humming, a slow, unsure melody that may once have been a lullaby. It drifted from the kitchen, where she rinsed mugs while stepping over cereal box castles the kids had built. They'd been here for 3 days. And for the first time in years, the silence inside Jack, once deafening, had begun to crack. He wasn't used to mornings with voices. He wasn't used to beginnings. The screen door creaked. Grace stepped outside, drying her hands on a towel. She still held herself like a soldier, shoulders squared, spine straight. But her eyes had softened, her voice gentled. "We're not on your way, are we?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "You've brought the place back to life." She smiled, but something behind it flickered. "What?" he asked. She hesitated. "Ellie keeps drawing pictures of you," she said. "Not just you now. You years ago, wearing firefighter gear." Jack felt the breath catch in his throat. "She's never seen pictures of Aaron's fire," Grace said. "I never showed her, but she draws you holding her. Holding her the way I pictured it 100 times in my head, but never spoke aloud." She pulled out a worn manila envelope, opened it, and handed him a folded paper. A charcoal sketch, childlike yet deeply precise. A man soot-streaked, cradling a small baby wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. The baby was Ellie. There was no mistaking it. Jack's hands trembled. "I was there," he whispered. 3 years ago. The base fire. I carried her out, but they never told me who she was. I didn't know she made it." Grace swallowed hard, then reached into the folder again. This time, she pulled out a letter. "I found this in Aaron's things," she said. "I've read it 100 times, but today you need to see it." Jack took the letter with reverence. "Gracie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. And God, I hate that. But I need you to know, there was a man in that fire. I didn't catch his name. He carried Ellie like she was glass. His eyes, they looked like they'd seen the end of the world, and still walked back into it. If you ever find him, tell him this. I saw him. I trusted him. And I believe you'll find your way back to him, because he looked like someone trying to come back to life too. All my love. Aaron." Jack folded the letter with shaking hands. Grace was watching him, her eyes damp. "He trusted you. And so do I." Jack couldn't speak. He felt hollow, full, wrecked, alive. "He was braver than me," he whispered. "No," Grace said. "You both were brave, in different ways." From inside the cabin, Ellie's voice called out, clear and full. "You were there, and I remembered." Jack turned, stunned. Ellie stood barefoot in the doorway, teddy bear in hand. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she walked to him, slipped her tiny hand into his. "You remembered," Jack said. Ellie nodded. "You didn't let go." Jack blinked hard. I never meant to. And for the first time in 3 years, something in his heart began to thaw. That evening, after the dishes were done and the children were asleep, Grace stood in the hallway, staring at a closed door. It hadn't been opened since they arrived. Jack came to stand beside her. "That one stayed shut a long time," he said quietly. Grace looked at him. "What's inside?" He hesitated. "Memories. Some I chose. Some I didn't." She didn't push, but her eyes told him she wasn't going anywhere either. Jack sighed and reached for the knob. "You should see it." The hinges creaked as the door swung open into a room preserved by grief. The air was faintly lavender and old paper. A narrow bed, a quilt with little hand-sewn flowers, sun-faded drawings on the wall, a ballerina music box, and against the far wall, a cedar toy chest. "My daughter's room," Jack said. Her name was Lily. Grace said nothing. She was 5, same age as Ellie now. He stepped toward a shelf and pulled down a wooden box. Inside, a bracelet of yarn, a crayon drawing labeled, "My Daddy is the Bravest," and a stack of unopened letters. Jack handed her the top one. "I never read them," he said. "They found them in her backpack." Grace unfolded the note. "Dear Daddy, I know you're working with fire today. Please come home for dinner. Mommy says your eyes smile even when your face is tired. I love your eyes. Love, Lily." She handed it back without a word. "I carried so much guilt," Jack whispered. "I was the first responder, but I wasn't fast enough." "You carried everyone else," Grace said. "But who carried you?" "No one," he admitted. "I didn't let them." Grace reached for the toy chest. "May I?" He nodded. She opened it gently. Inside were tiny clothes, a slipper, a doll missing one eye. At the bottom, a photo. Jack younger, beaming, Lily on his shoulders. "You built this room with love," she said. Jack nodded, his voice rough. "I didn't save my family that night, but maybe I was meant to save someone else's." And in that moment, in the quietest part of the house, the past didn't feel quite so heavy, and the future didn't feel so far away. Sometimes healing doesn't come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper in the rain, like a child's hand in yours, like a door that finally opens. Jack gave a quiet nod, as though trying to push the memory away, as though agreement could quiet the ache. But Grace, her voice a thread of truth in the quiet room, reminded him softly, "Forgetting isn't the same as healing." And Ellie didn't remember the fire the way most children might. Not in images, not in screams or smoke. She remembered through sensations, through people, through the emotions left behind like fingerprints on the soul. That kind of memory, it was sacred, sacred and heavy. Jack lifted his eyes, locking them with Grace's. "I think I was meant to meet her again," he said, voice hushed by all more than doubt. Grace set the photo in her hand gently down, then reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded note, worn at the edges by time and heartache. "I think you were too," she whispered, handing it to him. "Aaron left this with his medals. I didn't know what to do with it until now." Jack opened the note with care, as though the paper might shatter if he wasn't gentle enough. "If you find the man who carried our daughter, look into his eyes. You'll know. You'll know if he needs to be saved, too." The words hit him like a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His throat tightened, grief and grace mingling in the space between. "He believed in you," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "He gave Ellie to you, not just because you were there, but because he saw something in you. Something good." Jack stared down at the note, the weight of it sinking into his hands like a truth too long buried. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why did I survive when others didn't?" Grace didn't hesitate. Her answer came as naturally as breath. "So you could build something from the ashes." And there they stood, two souls bent but not broken, each holding grief shaped differently, but finally, blessedly, not holding it alone. Jack closed the memory box with reverence and turned toward Grace. "Do you ever wonder if second chances are real?" She didn't smile, but her gaze was unwavering, filled with a quiet fire. "Only when I look at you," she whispered. Later that night, When the house was still and the fire had dimmed to soft embers, Jack returned to his workshop, not to run from memories, but to create something new. He pulled a plank of cherry wood across the table, measured twice, and made the first deliberate, clean cut. This toy chest wouldn't be another forgotten project, collecting dust. It wouldn't be locked away behind a closed door. This one would be filled with drawings, games, laughter, and light. This one would be for Ellie, and if time was kind, for someone else, too. The first time Grace took the kids into town, the scent of yesterday's rain still lingered in the air. They rode in Jack's old truck, the windows fogged with warmth, Max riding up front beside Jack, the girls in back, Ellie clutching her bear as though it held her world. Grace sat quietly, her eyes studying the road like it might disappear beneath them. "It's not much," Jack said, gesturing as they approached the outskirts of Maple Glen. One grocery store, a diner that still makes pie from scratch, and a hardware shop run by a guy who's been 90 for about 20 years. Grace smiled, a real one this time. "Sounds perfect." Jack glanced sideways at her. "You sure you're ready for this?" She exhaled, slow and deliberate. "We can't live in your cabin forever." Jack's voice dipped. "People are going to wonder." "They already do," she replied, lips curling wryly. Maple Glen was the kind of town where news traveled faster than wind. Jack, who had stayed invisible for years, now appeared at the general store with 4 children and a woman in combat boots. The town took notice. The first to speak was Mrs. Donnelly, the silver-haired widow who ran the bakery by the post office. She leaned out her shop window just as Grace stepped onto the sidewalk. "You're the one staying with Jack Callahan?" she asked, not unkindly. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I am." Mrs. Donnelly squinted, studied her like a librarian appraising a first edition. "Good," she finally said. "He's needed someone to bring him back to the world." Grace blinked, surprised. "I thought you were going to ask if we were married." Mrs. Donnelly laughed, a rich, knowing sound. "Oh, honey, around here we've learned not to mistake quiet for loneliness or company for scandal. You're both grown, and we've all been broken before." Grace stood still for a moment, not quite knowing how to respond to a welcome laced with such tenderness. Inside the store, Max stayed close to Jack, watching how he spoke with the clerk, how his hands moved with quiet precision, counting change not by sight, but by instinct. It was ordinary, but to Max it was something rare, something safe. "You ever work with your hands?" Jack asked as they left. Max shrugged. "Not really. Helped my dad change a tire once." Jack nodded, considering. "Well, maybe it's time you learned how to use a saw." Max's eyes lit up, a flicker of something he hadn't let himself feel in a while. Hope. Outside the diner, Ellie paused before a faded flyer pinned to the community board, a dog in a party hat. "That's Rufus," said a voice behind her. She turned to find an old man with a cane and a coat patched at the elbow. "He's the town's unofficial mayor." The man grinned. "Been in more parades than the high school band." Ellie smiled just barely, but Grace noticed. In a single afternoon, the town had opened its arms. That evening, as the truck rattled back up the winding mountain road, Grace looked out at the trees softening in the dusk. "People here are kinder than I expected." "They've had to be," Jack said. "Everyone here's lost something, a spouse, a child, a dream. They remember what it feels like to fall." Grace nodded quietly. "And you?" Jack kept his eyes ahead, still learning how to get back up. The days that followed were full of quiet transformation. Jack cleared out the spare room. Grace painted the walls a gentle sage green. The kids helped Max assemble old bunk beds Jack had salvaged from a neighbor's barn. They added flowers to the windowsill and a new quilt to the couch. This wasn't just temporary anymore. Jack's porch, once a place where silence brooded, now bore muddy boots, chalk scrawls, toy truck, and Ellie's drawing of a house with a red roof and stick figures holding hands, proudly taped to the wall. One afternoon, while Jack mended the fence, Pastor Breener arrived. He wore a faded denim jacket with a small chaplain patch and eyes that had seen both war and resurrection. Ruth Donnelly says you've got a full house, he said lightly. One of the kids called you Dad the other day. Jack blinked. Did she? The pastor smiled. Well, rumor or not, we've got a picnic this Sunday. You and your guests should come. Let the kids run around. Let Grace meet folks without a shopping cart in her hand. Jack hesitated. I haven't been to church in a long time. The pastor shrugged. We don't keep track. Sometimes it's not about the place. It's about the people you bring with you. Jack gave a small nod. I'll think about it. That evening, he told Grace. She was on the porch brushing Nora's hair. Abby and Ellie were drawing on the steps with chalk. A picnic, she said, raising an eyebrow. Sounds normal. Jack laughed softly. Not sure we qualify. Grace looked at him, her eyes steady. Maybe not, but I think we're becoming something close. That night, Jack paused outside the kids' room. Max was already asleep, hand dangling off the bunk. Nora was snoring softly. Abby was curled into herself, holding Ellie's hand. But Ellie was still awake, eyes open, meeting his in the dim hallway light. He stepped inside and knelt beside her. Can't sleep. She shook her head. You like it here? He asked gently. She nodded. Why? She turned toward the wall and whispered. Because it feels like someone is remembering me. Jack's heart caught in his chest. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because he understood completely. It began with a porch light. One morning, just after sunrise, Jack stepped outside to find Ellie already sitting on the top step, teddy bear in her lap, watching the quiet yard. He sat beside her, followed her gaze. The yard looked lived in. Muddy footprints. Chalk drawings faded by rain. A red bike missing its front wheel. A mess, but a beautiful one. Did you leave the porch light on? Ellie asked. Jack nodded. Every night. Why? So people know they can find their way back. She nodded thoughtfully. That's what it feels like here. What does? Like we found our way back. He sat beside her in silence as the sun climbed above the trees, painting the world gold. Later that day, Jack returned to his workbench with fresh cherry wood and a purpose. Ellie watched, curious and quiet. What are you building? A toy chest, he said. For you. She blinked. Just me. He smiled. Maybe for your sisters too, but mostly you. She considered. It's okay if it's for everyone. Touched, Jack nodded. You're a good big sister. She said nothing, but her eyes glimmered with something soft. Grace found him hours later, covered in sawdust, sanding the edges with purpose. You've been at this all day, she said. I used to build because I didn't know what else to do. Jack replied. Now, I know who I'm building for. Grace leaned against the rail. The kids adore you. He shrugged, shy. They're easy to love. She tilted her head. And me? Jack froze. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because of how easily the question came. I don't know, he admitted. Not because I don't feel it, but because I'm scared if I say it, I'll break the quiet. Grace looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes quiet can be lonely. He searched her eyes. Are you lonely? She nodded, but it's a different kind now. Not empty, just waiting. He set the sander down, stepped closer. I'm not ready for promises, but I'm here, and I care. That's the truth. Grace met his gaze. That's more than I've had in a long time. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old notebook, one he hadn't dared open in years. Inside were sketches of chairs, signs, half-finished dreams. He paused at one, a porch swing, labeled for Lily's lullabies. He hadn't been able to build it then, but now he picked up a pencil and added a new sketch beside it. Same swing, just longer. Room for 2 kids. Maybe 3. Grace came in, a blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the page, then at him. For Ellie? She asked. He nodded. And for Lily. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. There's room for both. Sunday came, and with it, the town picnic. Maple Glen turned out in full, lawn chairs, laughter, dogs, and grills. Jack arrived with Grace and the kids, and conversations paused, not from suspicion, but curiosity, maybe even hope. Jack let Max drag him toward the games. He watched Nora and Abby compete in a sack race. He saw Ellie by the lemonade stand, eyes wide with wonder. Later, Pastor Breener approached with a plate of pie. "You look different," he said. Jack chuckled. "That your polite way of saying I've gone soft." The pastor smiled. "It's my way of saying you've come back." Jack looked across the field. Grace stood near the dessert table, her hair lit by the sun, her laughter rising like a melody he hadn't known he missed. Maybe he had come back, or maybe he'd never really left. Just waited for someone to knock, and for someone to stay. When they returned to the cabin that night, Ellie quietly slipped something into Jack's hand before she padded off toward bed. It was a small folded card, crafted with care, the handwriting unmistakably a child's, awkward, blocky, but full of intent. "Dear Dad, thank you for coming back. Love, Ellie." Jack didn't cry. Not then. He simply stood still for a long moment, letting the words take root somewhere deep and trembling inside. Later, he turned on the porch light, like he always did, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a ritual for the ghosts. It felt like a promise, a quiet vow that the door of the heart, the home, would remain open. By morning, Jack found himself standing before the nearly completed toy chest. It stood like a relic of care in the soft light of dawn, every edge smoothed with patient sanding, the corners rounded gently to protect small fingers from harm. The lid settled softly with slow-close hinges that wouldn't slam or pinch. Across the front, he'd carved something simple but meaningful, a line of pine trees beneath an arching sky, and in the center a single light, a porch lamp glowing against imagined night. It was more than a box for toys. It was a sanctuary for what had been lost, and what was slowly finding its way back to him. And that thought, that something so sacred could return, terrified him. He didn't turn when he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. Grace stepped into the workshop wearing one of his flannel shirts tied at the waist, her hair damp, her presence quiet but grounding. "You've been out here since dawn," she said softly. Jack gave a small nod, still facing the chest. "Didn't sleep." "Why not?" He hesitated, then finally turned to face her. "Because I'm scared." Grace leaned against the doorway, arms folded gently. "Of what?" He let out a breath, heavy as regret. "Of wanting too much." She didn't press him, just waited. Of waking up and realizing all this, he gestured vaguely. Toward the cabin, toward the laughter filtering in through the open windows, was just borrowed time. Grace stepped forward, her voice so soft it nearly blended with the wind. "What makes you think you don't deserve it?" Jack gave a faint laugh, not bitter, just tired. "I spent 6 years hiding. From people. From life. I stopped believing second chances were a real thing." "Then maybe," she said gently, "it's time you started." He looked at her, eyes dark with emotion. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Grace replied, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. "But love, choosing it again, it's not about ease. It's about courage." Jack rested his hands on the workbench as if to steady himself. "I don't know if I have that." "You do," she said firmly. "You just forget sometimes." The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full of unsaid things, of mutual fear, of something growing. Grace stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper now. "I know what fear feels like, Jack. After Aaron died, I told myself I wouldn't let anyone close again, that it was safer to stay busy, stay useful, stick to the routine, the mission." She exhaled, eyes shimmering. But then Ellie started asking questions I couldn't answer, drawing things she shouldn't have known, and I realized maybe love finds us even when we're not looking. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. Grace continued, her voice steady despite the tremble just beneath the surface. "I'm not asking you to be a father tomorrow, or to promise me forever. I'm just asking you not to run." His hands trembled slightly. She reached out and took one in hers, gently, grounding him. "You're allowed to be afraid," she said, "but don't let fear make your choices for you." That afternoon, Jack took a drive into town. He told Grace he needed more hinges, but the truth was he needed space. A moment alone. He sat in his truck outside the hardware store for nearly 10 minutes before finally stepping inside. The old man at the counter, familiar in that way only small towns allow, nodded. "Don't see you around much," he said. Jack offered a thin smile. "Been busy." "That's what happens when people come into your life," the man replied with a knowing smirk. Jack bought what he needed, but he didn't go home right away. Instead, he crossed the street and stood in front of the church. He didn't go in. He just stood there, staring at the weathered double doors. They looked aged but solid, like they'd held fast through decades of storms. Maybe that was what Jack wanted to be. Maybe that was what he feared he wasn't. Before he left, he slipped a small envelope into the offering box beside the door. Inside was a note written in his meticulous, measured handwriting, for the ones who carry others, even when their own arms are tired. By the time the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting the yard in golden light, Jack returned to find Grace and the kids outside. Max was focused on building a birdhouse. Nora and Abby were gathering pine cones in a game of who could find the prettiest one. Ellie sat on the steps, her teddy bear beside her, watching the horizon like it might reveal something. When Jack stepped from the truck, Ellie ran to him, not with questions, but with open arms. She flung herself into his chest. "You came back," she whispered against his shirt. Jack wrapped his arms around her. "I'll always come back." Grace, standing on the porch, watched them, her eyes shimmering but steady. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Jack found her in the kitchen drying mugs. "I've been thinking," he said, voice quiet. She turned, waiting. "I was wrong. I said I was afraid of wanting too much. But really, I'm afraid of losing again." Grace stepped closer, her voice barely above breath. "Me too." There were no fireworks, no sweeping gestures, just two people standing in a kitchen, tired from life, but still open. Then, Jack reached out and gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "I'm still scared." Grace placed her hand softly on his chest. "So am I." And somehow, for the first time, fear didn't feel like a reason to run. It felt like a reason to stay. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled like ancient memory. Rain swept across the cabin, tapping on the windows like 1,000 questions from the past. Jack stood alone in the kitchen just after 5 a.m., coffee cooling in his hands, staring out at the soaked porch. 3 weeks ago, the sight of rain like this would have clenched something in his chest. It would have felt like drowning in grief he couldn't name. But now, the sound of 5 sleeping souls behind him gave it a different weight. He didn't brace for the storm. He simply listened. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Grace entered wrapped in one of his old flannels, her hair tied in a lazy knot, sleep still soft in her eyes. "Storm's back," she said, rubbing her arms. "Yeah," Jack replied, turning to her. "You okay?" She nodded. "I think so." They stood in that comfortable silence until a sound broke it. A knock. 3 soft raps against the front door. They froze. No one knocked at this hour. Not way out here. Jack moved to the door, careful and quiet, and opened it. A man stood in the gray morning light. Older, weathered, a white beard, a military ball cap in his hands, and eyes like worn stone, tired but kind. "Are you Jack Callahan?" the man asked, voice rough but calm. Jack nodded, uncertain. "Yes, I served with Aaron Holloway." Grace appeared beside Jack, breath caught in her throat. The man looked at her with a reverence that quieted the moment. "You must be Grace." She nodded slowly. "How did you find us?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered notebook. "He wrote about you," he said to Jack. "Not by name. Just the man who carried my daughter. He told me if anything happened, I'd know who to look for." He handed the notebook over. Jack took it, hands unsteady. Inside were field notes, drills, half-written letters, pages of memories. But one stood out, folded neatly, labeled in Aaron's handwriting, "For the man I never got to thank." Jack opened it with trembling fingers. I don't know your name, but I know your hands. I know how you held my daughter through the smoke. You didn't hesitate. That matters. I saw you disappear into the fire, even though you were already hurting. That matters too. If you ever find Grace or Ellie, I want you to know. You were enough. Brave enough. Strong enough. You carried what mattered. And maybe you're part of what comes next. Jack's hand shook. Grace read the letter too, tears trailing silently down her cheeks. The man cleared his throat. I don't mean to intrude. Just thought maybe it was time. He nodded once, gave a quiet salute, and disappeared into the storm like a messenger whose work was done. Grace sat on the couch, the letter in her lap, her voice trembling. That knock, it was the last thing I heard before everything changed. The night Aaron died. I heard it. She looked up. I used to think it was the end, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe that knock was the beginning. I just didn't know it yet. Jack leaned back, the rain gentler now, more lullaby than storm. He reached for her hand. Not tightly, just enough. I'm here, he said. Grace leaned into him, and in the quiet they listened, not for ghosts, not for pain, but for the sound of a world beginning again. A voice from the hallway, Mama? Ellie, pajama-clad, hair tangled by dreams, blinked sleepily. I heard a knock, she said. Grace bent down. So did we, sweetheart. Was it him? Ellie asked. Grace paused, then smiled softly. In a way, yes. Ellie looked thoughtful. Is it safe now? Before Grace could speak, Jack answered. Yes, he said, his voice like the earth, solid sure. It's safe now. Ellie took his hand, and together they moved to the window. Outside, the rain had lightened. The first threads of morning light painted soft gold across the misty trees. And for the first time in years, the knock hadn't brought sorrow. It had brought peace. By midday, the last traces of winter had vanished from the hills. Willow Road's trees stood lush and full, their leaves flickering like green applause in the sunlight. The cabin, once steeped in silence, now buzzed with life. Laughter spilled through open windows. Footsteps patted the porch. Laundry danced from a line between two trees. On that particular Sunday, Jack woke to the sound of a hammer. He blinked against the light, threw on a shirt, and stepped outside. What he saw made him stop. Mac stood in the yard, sleeves rolled up, working beside the old maple. A pile of pine boards lay nearby. Ellie sat cross-legged, sorting screws with quiet focus. Jack walked over. What's going on here? He asked. Max looked up, nervous but proud. You said every porch deserves a bench. Thought maybe the tree deserved one too. Jack raised an eyebrow. The tree. Ellie nodded solemnly. It watches over us. Jack chuckled. Fair enough. He knelt beside them. The boards had been cut and arranged with care, simple but earnest. Did you draw a plan? Max handed over a page from a notebook. The pencil lines were rough, but clear, clean, familiar. Jack saw himself in them. You two planning to do this alone? Max shrugged. Figured we'd try. Jack stood and clapped his hands. Then I guess it's time you learned how to set a dowel joint. By noon, the yard echoed with laughter, wood being shaped and sanded, boards being stained. Grace brought lemonade and sandwiches. Nora and Abby helped with paint. Ellie supervised barefoot, like a tiny foreman. When the bench was finished, Jack and Max carried it under the maple and set it gently in place. It stood solid, beautiful in its simplicity. Max stepped back, eyes shining. Looks like it was always meant to be there. Jack nodded, smiling softly. So do you. Grace brushed sawdust from her arms and crossed the yard with a thoughtful expression, softening her face. We should carve something into it, she said gently. Jack turned toward her, then glanced at the kids gathered around the bench beneath the old maple tree. What would we say? He asked. Silence fell, gentle, contemplative. Each of them fell into their own thoughts. Then Ellie stepped forward. She pressed her small hand against the backrest of the bench. Her voice was little more than a whisper, but it carried, for those who bring light, especially after the fire. Jack felt something rise in his chest, sharp and tender, catching at his throat. Grace looked at him, her eyes full of quiet wonder. That came from a letter, she said softly. Jack nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ellie. And from her. He took the chisel in his hands, weathered, familiar hands, and began to carve the words into the wood. Each stroke felt like a benediction, like sealing something sacred into place. Not just a message, but a memory made tangible. That afternoon, something unexpected began to unfold. People from town started to arrive, more than Jack had anticipated. Word had traveled, as it does in small towns, not through newspapers or headlines, but through the steady current of curiosity and kindness. They heard of the new family living up on the ridge. They heard about the man who used to walk through town like a shadow, now laughing with 4 children and a woman in uniform. They heard about the porch light that never went out, and now about a bench beneath a maple tree. Mrs. Donnelly brought apple pie warm from the oven. Pastor Breener carried folding chairs under both arms. A young couple arrived with lemonade, unsure if they belonged, but hoping they did. Grace was greeted with handshakes and smiles. People knelt to talk with the kids. They asked Max how he'd built the bench, complimented Ellie's artwork. Jack watched the whole scene unfold like someone quietly waking from a long and lonely dream. He stood on the edge of it all, as if unsure whether he was part of the picture. But slowly, steadily, his heart started to believe he was. At one point, Pastor Breener asked for a moment of quiet. He stepped beside the bench, one weathered hand resting on its back. "I've served in many towns," the pastor began, his voice calm, "but I've rarely seen healing arrive with such humility." He glanced around, eyes kind. It didn't come with speeches. It didn't announce itself. It came with a knock, with open arms, with shared silence, and simple acts of kindness. Then his gaze found Jack's. "You remind us that the people who carry others are often the ones who need carrying too." Jack shifted uncomfortably, emotions swelling beneath his ribs, but he held Pastor Breener's gaze. Grateful. Changed. "And so today," the pastor continued, "we gather not just to bless a bench, but to bless a beginning." Applause rippled across the clearing, some quiet, some with tears. Beside him, Grace reached for Jack's hand and squeezed. He squeezed back, not out of obligation, but because finally he wanted to. Later that evening, twilight draped the clearing in soft lavender and gold. Most of the guests had gone, their laughter fading down the dirt path. Ellie climbed onto the bench, her teddy bear tucked beneath one arm, her sketchbook in the other. Jack joined her without a word and sat beside her. She held up her newest drawing. 5 stick figures, a tall maple tree, a wooden bench, and hanging from one of the branches, a tiny glowing porch light. Jack smiled. "That's us." Ellie nodded. "It's home." He draped an arm around her small shoulders. "Do you know what this bench is for?" she asked. He looked at her gently. "Tell me." She rested her cheek against his arm. "It's for people who forget they belong, until someone reminds them." Jack kissed the top of her head, his voice rough with emotion. "Then let's keep reminding each other." And so they sat, father and daughter, watching fireflies dance across the yard like drifting stars. Inside, Grace moved through the kitchen. She turned on the porch light, not because darkness had come, but because some lights, once lit, should never go out. Rain came again in early June, but this time it wasn't a storm. It was soft, persistent, a gentle whisper against leaves and rooftops, the kind of rain that doesn't drive people inside, but invites them to pause, to breathe, to remember. Jack stood at the window, watching droplets meander down the glass like lazy travelers. His hair had grown shaggy, his beard, now 3 days untamed. Grace had teased him that morning, calling it his mountain philosopher look. He didn't mind it. Behind him, the house breathed with life. Nora and Abby were somewhere in the kitchen, laughing and making a mess that smelled faintly like cinnamon and joy. Max was in the shed, putting finishing touches on a birdhouse he swore could survive anything Vermont's weather could throw at it. Ellie sat curled in the armchair, sketching quietly, her teddy bear snug under her arm. And Grace sat at the table with a pen in her hand, writing real letters, folded, stamped, and sealed. Letters to old friends and soldiers she'd once served beside. People she'd never told she was okay now. People she'd never told she was okay now. She had started writing them the night after the picnic. Jack turned from the window and looked around the room. None of it felt temporary anymore. Not the mismatched mugs. Not the scratches on the wood floor. Not the drawings taped to the fridge. Not even the pile of boots by the door. Every corner whispered the same truth. This is home. His home. Their home. The knock came just after dusk. Jack didn't flinch. He rose, walked to the door, and opened it with calm hands. Pastor Briner stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. "Evening," he said, voice warm. "You're soaked," Jack said. "Worth it." The pastor grinned. "I was out near Hollow Creek and figured I'd drop something off." He handed over a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper. "What is it?" Jack asked. "A donation," Briner shrugged. "From the congregation. We voted to dedicate something in your name, but figured you wouldn't want a plaque." Jack chuckled. "You figured right." "So instead," Briner said, tipping his hat, "we thought we'd give you the seed." Jack unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a tin box filled with wildflower seeds. Tucked beneath was a handwritten note, "For the Garden of Second Chances." Jack felt his throat tighten. He looked up, but the pastor was already halfway down the path, humming to himself, disappearing into the rain like a ghost with kind eyes. That weekend, Jack and Grace tilled a corner of the yard near the bench. Ellie insisted on planting the first handful of seeds. Max read the names of the flowers aloud like a town crier at a sacred ceremony. Lupin, Columbine, Black-Eyed Susan. They planted them beneath the old maple tree, pressing each seed gently into the damp soil. Grace leaned close and whispered, "Grow something good here." Jack smiled, his hand over hers. "We already are." The days stretched longer. So did the laughter. One afternoon, Jack returned from town with a surprise hidden beneath a tarp in the back of his truck. A porch swing. The kind he had once sketched for Lily, but never finished. This one he built with Max, their hands working side by side, until it was ready. They installed it beneath the eaves, angled just right to face the hills. The first time Grace sat beside him on it, she didn't speak. She simply leaned into him and exhaled. It was enough. Above them, the porch light buzzed gently. Still on. Always on. One night in late summer, when the cicadas hummed like old lullabies in the trees, Jack stirred awake to find Ellie at the foot of his bed. He sat up, alarmed. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "I had a dream." He rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "About what?" She climbed into bed beside him and whispered, "About when the rain comes again." Jack waited. "In the dream," she said, "everyone was together, even the ones who are gone. They didn't say anything. They just smiled, and the rain didn't scare anyone." Jack laid back against the pillows, heart full and aching in the best way. "That sounds like a good dream," he whispered. Ellie snuggled against him, already half asleep. "It was because it didn't feel like the end." Jack closed his eyes. "No," he whispered into the quiet. "It felt like home." If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a longing, a hope, we'd love to know. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you think to hear how far these little quiet stories can travel. And if you want more moments like this, stories that heal, that remind us we're never too far from grace, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just an open invitation. Thank you, truly, for spending this time with us. In a world that moves too fast, your presence here is something we don't take for granted. Until next time, may your porch light always stay on, and may the next knock bring something beautiful.